So let's dive into the next session right away. I know we are running a little behind time, but we'll make up for it. So the next session is titled A Second Life, Family Office, Philanthropy and Beyond. What we want to cover here is, so how does one look at the afterlife of setting up of a very large business, right? There are several promoters who use their wealth towards creating change for the larger good. But from running a profit-driven enterprise where returns are clearly measurable in terms of how much money you make, the way in which a social enterprise is run is quite different, where returns are not really easy to measure. To answer some of these aspects, we have a panel of people, including Ashish, Dhawan of Central Square Foundation, Vidya, Shah from EdelGive Foundation, Lakshminarayan, or LAN as he's popularly called, from the Azim Premji Foundation. And moderating the whole proceedings would be Shloka Nath, who's the acting CEO of the India Climate Collaborative and Sustainability Policy and Advocacy Portfolios of the Tata Trusts. We'll begin the session quickly after this 1-minute video from our sponsor.
Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. My name is Shloka Nath and I'm the Head of Sustainability and Policy and Advocacy at the Tata Trusts. And I'm also the Acting Director of the India Climate Collaborative. We're here today to talk about philanthropy and its evolution in India. The 1990s saw liberalization of the Indian economy, and of course, this eventually led to significant wealth creation by entrepreneurs and the emergence of many individuals with the capacity and the intent to give away large amounts of philanthropy. In fact, the cumulative wealth of the 100 richest people in India has grown by over 50% in the past decade. The rise in wealth creation, the complexity and diversity of social development issues in India that need attention, combined with the global interest in philanthropy, has created a real momentum of dialogue around family offices and philanthropy in India today. So the core practices and nuances of philanthropy, they do require one to combine the head and the heart. The sheer scope of issues in India, the variety of nonprofit organizations, and the constantly changing regulatory landscape results in an extremely complex giving environment. Although charity has always been a part of India's culture, results-based philanthropy is more. It must be highly intentional to solve social and environmental issues one is passionate about. And so philanthropy in India continues to grow. In 2020, private sector funding totaled about INR 64,000 crores, close to 23% more than the previous year. In fact, families' interest in philanthropic activities is also deepening. Research by EdelGive suggests that 95% of family business owners have philanthropic interests and commitments. Globally as well, philanthropy is changing. The simple act of giving money to deserving causes while still at the heart of philanthropic endeavor is not enough. New ways of giving are emerging, with philanthropists taking the very best of key learnings from the corporate world to help add rigor and discipline to philanthropic activities in ways that can maximize impact. While today's philanthropists may be driven by the same desires as their forebears, wanting to give back to society, they differ in the confidence of their ambition, their international reach, the structures adopted, and the discipline of measuring impact. Just as many of these philanthropists have emerged as disruptors in the business world, so too are they looking to drive innovation in new approaches to philanthropy. Today, we're joined by three of the most thoughtful names in philanthropy in India. I personally think they're all pioneers in what they're doing, and I've had the privilege of learning a lot from each of them. We're going to discuss the key drivers for philanthropy in India today, the strategies and the structures behind their philanthropic activity, as well as how philanthropists can seek to collaborate and if they should. Vidya Shah is the executive chairperson of EdelGive Foundation, the philanthropic arm of the Edelweiss Group, and she's the force behind EdelGive's brand of collaborative philanthropy. She founded EdelGive Foundation in 2008 to bring a more embedded approach to Edelweiss's philanthropic activities, and we'll talk to her a bit about that shortly. We also have K.R. Lakshminarayan, also known as Lam, the Chief Endowment Officer at Azim Premji Foundation, primarily focused on developing and executing the foundation's philosophy for philanthropy. He currently manages investments worth about 40 billion USD and has previously served as Chief Strategy Officer and Head of M&A for Wipro Technologies. Vidya and Lan are joined by Ashish Dhawan, who is the founder and chairman of Central Square Foundation. He's a founding member of Ashoka University, and prior to this, he spent 2 decades in the investment management business. He ran one of India's leading private equity funds, Chris Capital. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to kick off today's panel with a question for Vidya, actually. Vidya, can you tell us a little bit more about EdelGive Foundation? It's been in the sector today for close to 13 years. It's acted as an aggregator, really, by functioning at the nexus of different entities in the philanthropic ecosystem. You look to create systemic change. Can you tell us a bit about what has driven you and EdelGive to be this ecosystem enabler for philanthropy in India? And how would you describe your brand of philanthropy?
Thanks, Shloka. Thanks, Amit and IiAS for having me here today. I'll speak a little about my own personal journey, which really began by writing checks like many others. And soon after, though, I began searching for a more thoughtful philanthropic structure for investors in India. And EdelGive is about 15 years old, 14, 15 years old now since. And our approach actually over these 14 years has transformed to include more and more a lens around social justice and gender equality. My background is both as a financial services professional and an entrepreneur, if you will. We began our journey of giving as a firm and a family quite early. This journey was, of course, based on the notions of gratitude and responsibility to broader society, a gesture of thanks for the education, the opportunities, the success that came our way. But I think I entered completely blind. I had no understanding, I had no experience, no exposure, none whatsoever. So a large part of the transformation and the evolution of EdelGive has actually come from the lessons we learned along the way. When we started out, I was struck by the stark difference between what we thought we were enabling and the grassroots reality. And we all know now that social change is so complex and interconnected, and therefore solutions have to also involve shifts in beliefs, attitudes, and approaches. And we became aware of the richness and the vibrancy of Indian civil society, the several small and medium-sized NGOs that may not have the best processes or the best 5-year plans, but they do have their fingers on the pulse of the communities they serve, and they're actually our best bet to solving the problems of our country. And we also realized that we had naively equated poverty to economic deprivation alone, without delving deeper to understand, the underlying threads of unequal opportunity, class, caste, and gender. And this became very evident when we began to particularly witness the role of gender in every program, whether girls out of school or early marriage or unpaid work or unequal pay or violence and abuse. So all of this really had this undercurrent of deep-rooted biases and discrimination that a traditional approach to transforming education or livelihoods was not capable of addressing with any success. So for a foundation like ours, it became imperative to focus on systems change, to do it holistically by focusing on creating equal access of opportunity to basic education, earning a decent livelihood, upholding the essential human freedoms of a modern society, and of course, Shloka, you'll understand, rejuvenating our planet. So to my mind, it has been one of my greatest learnings that if private philanthropy is to make any dent, we have to make significant but intelligent financial, intellectual investments over the long term. And while we speak of patience and collaboration and risk-taking, we have to accept that solutions will have to be accounted for, perhaps even driven by affected stakeholders. So in a sense, we're a foundation that believes deeply in working at the ecosystem level as much as at the grassroots level on the principles of collaboration, co-learning and sharing. And we're committed to building a stronger philanthropic sector in the country with a more progressive lens that moves beyond the charity top-down perspective into a focus around grassroots-led social justice and gender equality. Our partners have been really instrumental in shaping this work, in field building, nurturing local institutions, support systems, and mechanisms that enable best practices and collaboration. And because of this, we've been able to also build our collaborative work around coalitions and collaboratives that focus on primary education, women empowerment, climate with you, Shloka, at the ICC, the Migrants Resilience Collaborative, and of course, the Grow Fund.
Thanks, Vidya. And I sort of, have been a long-standing, I think, admirer of your ecosystem approach. I think, your point on the fact that if private philanthropy really seeks to make any kind of, impact, we do have to look at patient long-term bets. And I think that's actually a great question for you as well, Ashish, because you've transitioned from hedge fund manager to a philanthropist. And it really demonstrates a new wave of philanthropy in India because you've really built and invested in a variegated ecosystem of philanthropic organizations. Could you also share some of your learnings with our audience?
Thanks, Shloka, and thank you, Amit, for having me here. So I made the transition a little bit after Vidya, about a decade ago, from the corporate world to working full-time on philanthropic projects. I think, as you mentioned, my initial focus was on education, working on Ashoka University and Central Square Foundation that works on school education. And more recently, apart from these two, I've set up a few other foundations to work on other issues that are relevant for our country. I really have learned a lot over the course of this last decade, and I'm humbled at how many people have sacrificed so much to very early in their career, work in a dedicated manner in this sector versus some of us who are very comfortable and make the transition much later. But I also realize that these are very, very complex problems. I think coming from the corporate world, you feel that you can overcome, any challenge and solve things within a 3 to 5 year time frame. I think most social problems are very complex and often take, 10, 15, 20 years. You can start to turn the needle earlier, but really in terms of fundamental change, it takes much longer. I think what attracts me most is to see if we can bring about systemic reform in many of these areas. To take an area like education, where the Azim Premji Foundation is a very, very large, significant player and has been active for so long. We have done a great job as a country in massifying education, in ensuring that children go to primary school, now middle school. But in terms of quality, there really hasn't been much improvement in the last 10 to 15 years. Even when it comes to very foundational or basic literacy and numeracy skills. And so at Central Square Foundation, we took this on as a challenge, and we worked closely with the center, but also 12 state governments in a sort of system reform mode, where it's the state's own system reform, and we work behind the scenes and over multiple years to try to drive change. It's not easy to drive change in a system where there's a lot of inertia, where there are, unless the transaction changes in the classroom, closest to the child, nothing really is going to happen. Governance changes alone don't lead to anything. So I just use that as an example to point out that, government here spends almost 7 lakh crore on education. And if you look at school education, government spends about 5 lakh crore. So anything that philanthropy does will be a drop, in the ocean. And so our belief has always been that the role of philanthropy is to innovate, to do things differently, which a behemoth like government may not be able to do, to build evidence. Once you do things differently along with partners, and it's often NGOs, new organizations that are actually doing the innovation, not foundations. But we can pay for and we can ensure that the evidence building, so not only supply shaping is done well, but evidence building is done properly. And then one of the muscles that NGOs lack is how do you translate, innovations that are working moderate scale into system change. So that requires advocacy and policy change, but it also requires policy implementation. How do you work with the system to drive change and involve NGO partners in doing so? So that's what I've been most interested in. How does one drive system reform, even though it's very, very hard? And learning from some states in India, learning from other contexts in the developing world. And that's at the core of a lot of the work we do. Because our belief is that we're not working on areas which like, democratic reform or social justice. I think those often pit you against the state, and it's hard to partner with the state on those issues, and they're very important issues to work on. Many of the issues we're working on, the state is often the largest player. And so finding ways to work with the state collaboratively is very, very critical. And it is the highest point of leverage and the only sustainable way to drive change.
Thanks, Ashish. I think that was really well said. I think especially your point on philanthropy or philanthropic endeavors being additional and not seeking to replicate what already exists. You've also talked about building an enabling environment for the wider development sector. And that actually brings me to you, Lan. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you've created an enabling environment for a thriving family office. If you can talk to us a little bit more about where you stand on the build versus buy, as well as what you believe is an appropriate size to do this on your own.
Yeah, thanks, Shloka. Thanks, Amit, for having me over again. So this, the build versus buy choice is and I'm sort of going to address it from the family office, investment office perspective. We can also have a similar debate on the philanthropic part as well. One can talk about it, but on the investment office part of it, I think it's a factor about, in my assessment, about 4 things that one needs to think about. One is obviously the absolute size. What's the size of capital that you are wishing to deploy or having to manage over a sustained period of time? Second is the return expectation. In terms of what you expect to spend and therefore what do you expect to earn, and what are the steps in between, what are the additional add-ons in between, be it for inflation adjustment, be it for taxation and so on and so forth. So expected returns. Third is the desire between discrete and continuous. Is it a consistent commitment over a long period of time, or is it something that is your activity or your philanthropic intent such that you can do with certain amount of variability? That again determines how you would think. allocate assets, and how do you sort of manage that? And the fourth is your desire and intensity, or desire for intensity in management. Is it something that you want and you enjoy doing, versus you think that it's best left to somebody else? So the factor of these four kind of determine how you sort of think about it. And when we sort of looked at it and on all these things, because we came from a history of having first had a family office way before, but 5-6 years before we started the foundation, or not foundation, before we sort of institutionalized the foundation. And the way, since many of our institutions were set up for perpetuity, like our university and things like that, we realized that it is best, and obviously given the size, we felt that it would be ideally for us. But I think this is one way of looking at it. Each person, organization can answer these four questions, and I think they will come to what's right for them.
Thanks, Lan. That was very helpful. And I do have, another question for you, but I'm going to come back to you in a minute. I actually wanted to ask Vidya and Ashish this next question, because it's a really persistent sort of debate within the philanthropic sector. We've heard about a number of large corporations here in India, their foundations as well, going beyond mandatory CSR requirements and really venturing into institutional giving. And I just wanted to ask both of you to reflect on this growing trend. How do we convince sort of more philanthropies or family offices to invest in more institutional funding? Vidya, perhaps you can speak to the GROW initiative over here as well. I think that's a very important sort of, really, evolutionary sort of piece of work that you're doing. And Ashish, you as well, maybe you could talk about what you're planning to do through AIP. I think that is also a very, very sort of crucial endeavor. Vidya, perhaps you could go first.
I think the conception of the GROW Fund, as we call it, the grassroots resilience, ownership and wellness, that actually came largely because, we were part of an initiative called Pay What It Takes, which is led by Britspan, which is a very reputed nonprofit consulting firm. And the whole idea of Pay What It Takes was to look at systemic change in funder and NGO practices and mindsets in India. The overarching objective was to build the emerging field for true cost funding, through collaborative action. Now, we're talking to the startup and the young entrepreneur ecosystem, and they will be very, very surprised if their investors question whether their CEOs or their enterprise functions need to get paid. Whereas if you look at the nonprofit world, there is really very little empathy towards building orgs and funding the cost of org development. In fact, we don't really have good metrics for average, what we call indirect costs. And what we found was, on average, it would range as much as 5% to 51%, depending on the size and depending on the ability of that organization to raise funding for it. So even if you take an average of about 22%, we found that the average funding of these costs was only 9%, leaving a really huge gap. And then you bring into the picture COVID. And as a result, we found that a lot of NGOs were really, really financially stressed over the last couple of years. Many of them ended up just using whatever reserves they had to bridge the gap, or most actually gave up any investment in org development. And I think the exacerbation by COVID was such that majority, about 54% of NGOs, had less than 3 months of operating reserves. Now, this is a very, very precarious situation to be in. And the research further showed that organizations that were set up by Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi leaders faced higher financial distress. Now, these were inequities that we felt obviously needed to be understood, but also corrected. And so what we found is that if you systematically try and work with NGOs and invest in org development, they tend to grow faster than orgs that don't. And that was really the genesis. And in fact, tomorrow, this 100 crore Grow Fund will announce 100 grantees who will receive a 2-year grant to cover core costs to build, just simply to build org sustainability and financial resilience. So Edelweiss and our funding partners for Grow have just brought together a sort of a collective approach of bringing great minds, businesses, processes, and organizations to find a solution to this problem of sustainability in the sector. And they deeply believe in this vision. So systemic change in mindsets and practices from both funders and NGOs is really what we are after with Grow.
Thanks, Vidya, and congratulations. I've had a small part to play in Grow, and it's been wonderful to see what you've done with it. Just how do we get more folks to do what you're doing in the sector?
I think the more people spend time in the sector, and the learning journeys that even Ashish spoke about, the more you really immerse yourself, you see firsthand the problems. And I think over time, as our market becomes more sophisticated, I do believe that while we have a lot more money coming in philanthropy, you alluded to it, Shloka, I think the practice of philanthropy is still very nascent. It's still not reached a certain level of maturity. And the way we look at issues, the way we look at some of the problems that we need to solve, we speak about, climate, for example, or gender receives a paltry 3 or 4% of overall funding each. So these are the issues, as well as and issues like org costs. These are the new things that young philanthropists in particular, I'm hoping, because of their own personal experience of setting up organizations also, will become a little more open to understanding and funding.
Thanks, Vidya. Ashish, do you agree with that assessment? Is that one of the reasons you've built out AIP, or is there sort of more systemic work that we need to do to convince others that institutional funding is the way to go?
Yeah, so I think obviously CSR came in a few years ago, and that provided much more capital and a certain rigor and professionalism that for the not-for-profit sectors. Of course, it's more skewed towards larger organizations. The big, in a sense, get bigger with CSR, and it does prioritize a few areas like education, health, and there are many other areas that get ignored with CSR. I think philanthropists can come in and take more risks in a sense than CSR can come in earlier into many of these organizations and can sometimes even work longer on issues. CSR have to define projects as 1 year, 3-year projects. I think as philanthropists, you can work on something for 20, 30 years and really drive change over a long period of time. And if you look at how, when Rockefeller first did his philanthropy, and worked on yellow fever, if it were a 3-year approach, you wouldn't have eradicated yellow fever, or the approach that the Gates Foundation has taken as well to working on polio, malaria, etc. These require, working for long periods of time. So our belief is that, India is at the moment where the US was like 100 years ago. And 100 years ago was when, Carnegie and Rockefeller really made their big contributions. And then a lot of wealth was created in that robber baron era. And after the role models of Carnegie and Rockefeller, it became the norm for rich families to set up foundations. And then each decided the area they wanted to focus on, their approach, etc. And I believe, a lot of wealth creation obviously has happened in India. I think folks like Mr. Premji have really set a very high bar in terms of what they've done. I think people like Nandan have been extremely innovative in terms of what they've done, different approach, and many others already are doing incredible work, and they serve as role models. And I think we will see a tsunami or an explosion of wealth creation in the next 20, 30 years. And as wealth gets crystallized, I think more and more for first generation entrepreneurs, particularly in knowledge industries, we will see folks, the norm will be to set up a foundation and to do philanthropic work. We've already seen it through collective projects, like Vidya's worked on very critical projects like Grow. I mean, even at Ashoka, we have 200, founders and donors at Ashoka. And if you'd asked me 7, 8 years ago when we started external fundraising, would 200 people be excited to be part of a collective project? I would have said no, that, that market doesn't exist in India. So I think through that process, we discovered that people are still at an early stage in terms of their giving. And as wealth gets crystallized, they're more comfortable, they figure out what they want to leave for their children, what their personal needs are. I think a number of people will sort of come to the realization they're not going to take it up with them. And so, you may as well start to figure out earlier, how you can give more and give better. My own belief is each person is going to do it in their own way. And it's very important for people to have agency and different approaches. It's a marketplace of ideas, it's a marketplace of different approaches. Some of the new age entrepreneurs may find very innovative ways to work on social problems, which are different from the approach that we take to, say, system reform. And they may be additive or sometimes even disruptive in the ecosystem. And of course, we should call out things that aren't working. Both ourselves and others should do the same, because a lot of things don't work. And all of us can learn from mistakes that we have made and others have made. But I do believe that, philanthropy is at an early stage. It will increase dramatically. And this plethora of different approaches, different types of actors in the ecosystem will enrich the ecosystem going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Ashish. I mean, the majority of the sector itself is, as you rightly pointed out, we're already starting to see a number of innovative approaches that, some of you are already pioneering. And I think that's also a very sort of optimistic and pragmatic way of looking at sort of where we're likely to go in terms of the overall growth of the sector here in India. Just different approaches, and actually perhaps ensuring that there's enough room and space for everyone to bring their own brand of philanthropy, their own philosophy to the table. And I think your last point on sort of ensuring that we're also building a culture of learning is a really, really important one. I don't think we often talk enough about sort of the risks involved and the necessity to fail, right? Like that it's all right to sort of fail as long as we're being honest about it and we're actually inputting those learnings into the work that we're doing. Something I'm sure you've learned from your numerous sort of entrepreneurial endeavors. But that actually brings me to you, Lan, because, speaking of different approaches, how do you draw a distinction between the work that Wipro CSR does versus what Azim Premji Foundation is doing? Is there a way that you're seeing to strengthen CSR giving through the family office's work? Would love to hear from you about some of those sort of trends that you're witnessing, within your own organizations.
Sure. The way we think about it, Shloka, is that companies must pursue CSRs that align with the objectives that their CSR committees or that organization has chosen. And that will be a function of what the company cares about, what's the direction and ethos of that company, etc. And I think in a publicly held company like Wipro, there is an independent board and they have their directions and they kind of thing. So they choose their direction. The family foundation, of course, is entirely driven by what the family is focused upon. There's a lot of and therefore, while there are commonalities, for example, both Wipro as well as the Azim Premji Foundation works in the area of education, school education and others. There are other areas where the foundation does more work, but that's not a priority for Wipro. So the way we think is that each one has their priorities. And that's true for, I think, what both Ashish and Vidya mentioned about different philanthropies. They'll have their thing. What one must always look for is points of intersection, commonalities, and there we should work together. And others, like I think both of them also mentioned before, there are enough problems in India that need focus and attention, and we should allow each one to spend their energies as to what matters most to them.
Again, well said. I think that's a good sort of summation of the distinction between the two as well. Lan, what for you is, if you had to off the top of your head, and I'm putting you on the spot here, but on purpose, what is for you some of the biggest trends that you're seeing in emerging in philanthropy? What's changed in the last, 2 years, given the sort of crisis that we've seen around us? And what are we likely to see going forward? This is actually a question for all three of you, but Lan, I'm putting you on the spot first.
Oh, actually, in the last 2 years, especially, have taught us so much. And I think first of all, there's undeniably greater empathy, and there's greater interest. There's a much deeper understanding of the suffering of the fellow citizen, fellow human being across. And therefore, that's translating to a greater, I think it's just the giving is becoming significantly more thoughtful. So there's a lot more thought going into. So just the fact that people have experienced both the power of privilege and also the powerlessness of privilege, especially during the second wave of COVID, have made people become that much more sensitive. That's I think the first one. Second is that there's a clearly greater need, and I think there's so much more being talked about. Therefore, there's greater need for things beyond education. I think that at some point in time there was this statistic that more than a quarter of the entire philanthropy in India was going to education, and the next biggest was something like 8% or something like that. Just the fact that there was so many more causes, there are so many more problems that manifest in different ways. That's opened up much more interest in many more areas. Climate is clearly one of them. Healthcare has suddenly had a lot of things. The whole issue of migrant labor and many things that came up out of the last couple of years is thing. And third, I think is that I think I've seen in my experience across, there is more younger generation wanting to invest their time and their energies into the thing. I think there was, as I grew up and I was in my corporate world, it was done by only one set of people went into the social sector and many people went into corporate sector. I think that's completely significantly changing. People are doing stints here and going back and stuff like that. I think so we're getting a greater influx of a variety of talent into the social sector. I would say these three are the top things that come to my mind.
Thanks, Lan. And I think a great assessment also of the power versus power and privilege conversation, as well as of course the momentum that's building around youth and their interest in the sector. I think that was really well put. Vidya, I'm going to come to you next. I have a slightly more specific question for you to answer around these trends as well, because I know you're a big proponent of the trust-based philanthropy movement. And I know that's something that's definitely come out of, COVID and the pandemic, because funding, of course, has had to be distributed fast without a web of restrictions. So we're really moving sort of towards the tenets of trust-based philanthropy. But at the same time here in India, we are seeing or rather one of the key features of philanthropy in India really is starting to become this building out of, of foundations and the implementation of their own development related projects. To me, that feels like a rejection of the trust-based philanthropy, movement overall. I'd wonder if you could, respond to that and whether you see that hampering the overall growth of the sector, or is it completely standalone? And of course, if you have any other thoughts about trends that you see emerging within philanthropy today.
I think I agree with a lot that Lan said in terms of the good things that have happened. I've seen this sector for over 15 years now. And when I started really, in a sense, giving in a very small way in 2002, I would not have, fast forward these almost 20 years, I wouldn't have imagined that there would be so much more money coming in, that the sector would become attractive for professionals from other spheres of life. That CSR in some ways, which was kind of we used to beat up CSR a lot in the initial days, saying that it's kind of changed the way giving is happening, especially by corporates, to become a lot more numbers driven as opposed to emotion and, empathy, which were really the driving factors of this sector. So there's been an incredibly good sort of change that we've seen. I think my sort of center of gravity, as it were, both individually and perhaps as a foundation, has been that, we need balance. So if you see the history of development in India, a large part of the work that has gotten done at the tier 3 and the class maybe C, D, E kind of towns has been really driven by communities. We don't see that living in the cities that we live in. But a large part of development in rural India, wherever it's happened, has been driven by community-based organizations and people living in these communities who've had to experience day-to-day the inequities that they faced. And so as a foundation, and as I spoke about Grow as well, has been really to focus on the small and medium-sized NGO, work on both funding programs, but more importantly also fund org costs, because without that, even these strengthening of the sector as a whole will never happen. On the other hand, like Lan mentioned, you have these younger philanthropists coming into, actively wanting to make change. And they're bringing a freshness of approach. I think their approach is more, it's in a sense, very creative. There's newer causes that they're supporting. There's more focus on institution building. I think Ashish spoke about Rockefeller and Carnegie. A lot of them actually built institutions for the US. Whether it was the colleges, whether it was the academic institutions, the research institutions, the measurement institutions, all that was built by a lot of these foundations. I think a lot of the new philanthropy is also doing that, and Ashish also alluded to that. If you look at what, even if you call them relatively older philanthropists like Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw or Chris Gopalakrishnan, who are focusing on new age ideas, on neuroscience and things like that, or even Nandan, really looking at technology to change the way development happens. There's a lot of work going on there as well, which I call sort of the institution building bucket, where you're really building the institutions that government, for various reasons, is just unable to build. And my only issue is that we need balance. We cannot let go of the grassroots organizations, because if you want change at the micro level, that is required. At the same time, if you want change at the macro level, this is required. And in between are these issues of social justice, of democratic freedoms, of gender equity, of climate. Those also need funding. So I think my only advice to younger philanthropists is to actually come and understand the plethora of opportunity that is there, and that there are great people and great organizations supporting, behind all of these organizations. And so to be very open-minded initially before they, make up their mind very quickly on which part to focus on.
Thanks, Vidya. I think that was also really well said. Ashish, we're going to come to you for the final question for this evening. If you could respond, to the same sort of question around what you see as some of the emerging trends, but I'd also like you to respond to this notion again, or this debate rather, within domestic civil society and philanthropy, that we should be supporting domestic CSOs by domestic philanthropy rather than relying on support from international foundations or external sources. Do you have a perspective on this? Should we be looking more towards, local resources for local problems, or is that an old argument that we should not be chasing anymore?
Yeah, so I think just coming back to the COVID moment, the question you'd asked earlier, I think as Lan was saying, I think it's put all of us in touch with our humanity, and also made us recognize the responsibility of, privilege in a sense. And so I think coming out of COVID, hopefully there's a desire, a greater desire to want to understand, India's problems and to want to work on them. And this is true of, I've seen with many of the younger entrepreneurs, maybe living through COVID, that realization has sunk in for many of us. In terms of the way forward, I think there are, as I mentioned, a plethora of approaches that will work. I think Vidya pointed out very correctly that Often smaller NGOs have been ignored. They are starved of funding. I think the whole sector, in a sense, when I look at it, lives hand to mouth. It has on its balance sheet, maybe 3 months of funding, if at all, and maybe commitments for up to a year of funding. And those commitments can sometimes vanish when market conditions change. So my own belief is that we need to have a big push within India where people should, particularly philanthropists, because they can do it, corporates can't, to build a small corpus. It doesn't need to be, years of funding, but at least to cover 1 to 2 years of annual expenses for most organizations. So I think that's a change we need going forward. And also a mix, like Vidya said, between grassroots approach, which requires more of a trust-based approach because you're far away from, these are small organizations, they know best, to building institutions, to working with government, because we've seen to drive change, you do need policy change, you do need money, government is an important actor, sometimes when they put things into mission mode. So I think it's a combination of these things. Without communities, it won't stick, it won't get the buy-in, it won't sustain. But without government, without institutions also, you won't often have the money, the new innovative approaches, the evidence, the rigor of measurement, etc. So it's a combination of all of these. As far as foreign funding versus local funding is concerned, I think in certain sensitive areas, most countries do want to block foreign funding. And so whether it's funding of certain types of think tanks, certain areas within, whether it's social justice, democratic rights, I think many of these areas, it's not just China, I think many countries are suspicious of, foreign interests in their hand. But I think in many other areas, to be honest, it's perfectly fine for foreign funding to come in. They do bring a new approach. They have a history of 100 years of doing things. They often are very systematic about how they do things. And so I wouldn't say it's one answer to the question. It's not black or white. I do think there are many foreign foundations in India that play an important role, and they should be part of the ecosystem. But I do also understand from an overall perspective why we'd want to not have foreign funding in certain sensitive areas in particular.
Thank you, Ashish. I think that was also just, I think an important point that you've made here, that it's really a case-by-case basis. And there are some areas where collaboration, is important. And of course, there are some areas that are highly sensitive, as you rightly mentioned, where we do need to sort of work hand in hand with state and see that we are aligned. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And I also really appreciate what you had to say about, where you see philanthropy evolving, the focus on community, the fact that government continues to be and will always be an important actor, and the need to leverage our work with government. I just want to thank all of you today, Ashish, Lan, Vidya. You've spent a good deal of time reflecting on the current state of philanthropic practice. You've helped us explore new possibilities, models, and interventions for the future. I feel like we should rename the philanthropic sector the social innovation ecosystem, because I think there's actually so much incredible sort of innovation that is coming out of it. Thank you for being with us here today and for sharing your evening with us. Thank you for your interest, your engagement. And I really wanted to say, a big, big thank you, of course, to the IiAS team. None of this would have been possible without all of you. So a very warm thank you to all of you as well for bringing this whole event to life. It's been wonderful to be a part of it this evening. Thank you once again to everyone, to our audience, and I hope you all have a wonderful day or night ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Shloka.
Thanks. Thanks,
Thank
Shloka.
you.